I normally work in structural engineering for a long time for the design of tall buildings and worked on hundreds of buildings. But when we look at the concepts behind the architectural design, then we understand a lot why the client sort of pays a lot more weightage to the architectural components, and sometimes we feel that the structure is being compromised, but in the view of the client, because the vision of the project is well known to them and not probably well understood by us engineers. So we always have sometimes difficulty, not in this particular project, but in many projects, in understanding why certain things have to be the way they are designed. And I think attending conferences like this helps to bridge that gap and creates an understanding between the architects and the engineers, especially on projects of this kind, which are iconic in nature. In fact, just last month, I was in Geneva, where we had a conference on bridges, same level as for tall buildings, and there was architects involved on bridge architects. And that is, as you know, that's a totally opposite area, where engineers feel that the bridges are their domain, and the architects are involved in the... But over there also, we understood a lot of major bridges, how the architecture is playing in to improve the overall projects. So I can say the same thing about this project a lot. So my first comment to the first presenter would be, was there any difficulty that you've kind of faced while working with this design with the structural engineers at any given time, or any of the other engineering disciplines?
I think in order to accomplish any project of such ambition, it's an absolutely critical part of the work and the working process, indeed, to collaborate and to collaborate from very early on. So we typically do not retreat to our own domain or our own office behind closed doors to cook up ideas that afterwards confront engineers with unsolvable dilemmas, but we're very interested in engaging in a very intense discourse and development process with a set of collaborators and engineers throughout the project. So in many ways, this project, like for example the other ones I showed, are a testimony to the ability of a joint team to think together and to comprehend the ambition of a project and really take that forward. And I think only in that kind of process can you actually achieve anything like this.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I would like to invite some questions or comments from our participants.
My question is for Ms. Yuki. Ms. Yuki, I really liked your presentation, and the design is very interesting. Wanted to know at what timeline was there any idea that came from the architecture while designing the interior design? Like, has there been any connect that you tried to take from the architecture and then try to portray in the interior design as well? The concept, in terms of concept.
Yes. Actually, this building we consider it very unique. As he has presented, the lower levels, it projects like a cascade, the three-dimensional landscape. So we took it as a given site to explore further. And throughout the slides, what we try to achieve always in our practice is to really to diminish or to dissolve the boundaries between interior space and outside space. So here, architecture, it already had this three-dimensionality to work with. So not just to trace the surface, but to incorporate that into the dynamic of the spaces inside. So in terms of materiality as a theme of the presentation today, we took more of the garden elements and to explore further to abstract manner. So bamboo as such, it's already a quite defined building materials and design elements that could softly mix the space. So in a very abstract manners and the accentuated manner, we try to explore to incorporate that into the interior spaces. So yes, we were quite inspired by the building design, and what we try to do is to work with it definitely, but consider the interior space as an extension of the outside.
Yes, it's Mark Garland from Toronto, and the building design is fascinating. It looks like a cartoon somewhat. And I wondered if Oli could tell us a bit about the terraces and the glass choice, and is there special lighting on the tower facade? I mean, the picture of the building looks like a computer-generated image rather than a real building. And so what color is the glass, and how is the articulation displayed so dramatically? It really looks fabulous.
Yeah, of course, the actual materiality sets out to do exactly two things. On one hand, be a function on a very abstract level to really embody the power of the three-dimensional concept of the facade, and at the same time express also the subtle differences between things. So the glazing of the pixel ribbon, if you like, and the glazing of the cassette facades are slightly different glass types with different degrees of transparency, a slightly higher degree of transparency in the pixels where life in a way penetrates and mediates the inside and outside spaces. Also with facade lighting, we're incorporating a kind of backlit spandrel system in the pixel ribbon to give it extra definition in a way at night and make it more readable as a three-dimensional space against the flatness, if you like, of the main tower shaft. I think for me, what is very important in the building is indeed the dialogue and the balance between the two systems, that you can understand that one is in a way eroded from the other, and that there's the tension between the two systems. And in a way also the balance between a kind of strict shape, a very abstract and pure shape that the tower has in its space form, that then is complexified through this intervention, which I think is very different to buildings that I think actually since we designed this building in end of 2000, very early 2008, end of 2007, and I had the feeling that to work with this somewhat almost virtual language of the pixelization would be something quite timely, because of course there is a digital aspect to this, yeah, in a very conceptual way, but at the same time there's a very literal and real aspect to it as a three-dimensional space of living and not as a purely abstract representation of something. And I think the coexistence of those two levels is what is very important for the building. But it was a kind of precursor to something that I think has since been quite widely adopted as a language, however yet not really built anywhere else. I think we're clearly the first ones to realize that. We now live in a world in which computer imagery allows anyone to do anything and pretend anything actually is real or happens. And of course that proliferation of images, I think, is one of the real struggles of the time, which is hardly ever discussed in its impact on architecture, as architecture then is kind of doomed to produce images instead of real space. But I think here we're really at the root of this, where space is what we're interested in, and the physical reality and the physical impact of it is what we're interested in.
So was that a design-build curtain wall contractor then? Did the contractor work directly with you during the design of the building?
Not during the concept design, but then during the later stages, of course, there's a lot of interactive back and forth to make these things not only buildable, but of course also economic.
Just to continue on your question, if I don't know if there is any, I'm sure there is, I'm aware of the wind tunnel studies done on the building, but because of the pixelation and, you know, the whole facade not being smooth, there would be some wind-induced, so I would say, sounds or vibrations. So has that been considered, you know, like whistling sounds that can ensue from the broken facade? Has that been?
Actually, the effect is the opposite. If you create a completely flat facaded square tower, that performs not very well in terms of effects of wind and wind tunnel testing. So the point by actually breaking up the facade, it disperses the wind forces in a much more effective way, and therefore is more effective engineering-wise. So it actually helps to reduce the wind loads on the building.
True, that I agree, but I'm just concerned whether on the local level where those pixels are broken suddenly, are there any local effects of the wind that you may be aware of that have been studied? Yeah.
No, I don't think so. The wind tunnel did not show.
Hello, I'm Dennis Poon from Thornton Thomas City Structural Engineers. I have a question for Oli. Maybe you can help us. This is a 340-meter tall building, residential. I think it's one of the highest tower in Bangkok. It's already the highest. What kind of structure? I saw from the construction picture, it is a concrete core, right? And can you share some of the information about the structure system, even briefly? One question I want to ask is, are you using any high-strength concrete for this project? And if that's the case, how high you can achieve in Bangkok? And the second question is, even it's a 340 meter, in order to reduce the sizes of the members of the shear wall and the columns, do you use any composite design in order to achieve the strength requirement or the stiffness requirement?
We have the contractors here too, so.
Yeah, I think there's a presentation about the structural design later, which is focusing on some of these questions. But if Ole can answer that,
just in principle, the building was designed as a concrete structure because simply of local customs and expertise. Of course, the building could have very well been executed in steel, but it was indeed specifically designed in concrete to fit the local market and capabilities. It is a concrete core and has a ring of, I think, 12 mega columns essentially as a second ring. But of course, the second ring is set back from the outer facades to provide a first layer of depth for the pixels up to that second ring of structure, and then further penetrations inside to achieve sufficient depth for the three-dimensionality of the sculpting. And this system, in a way, is relatively straightforward. Then, of course, there are localized solutions to cantilever out beyond these base and completely vertical structural systems inside the tower. And overall, I think this system has achieved sufficient efficiencies to get away with not super high strength concrete. It's not definitely not at the forefront of the extremes on that level, but really took into consideration very much as a basis of design the local achievability of things.
Sorry. Hi. When you designed your building, you've put a lot of flat areas at different levels, so you've got the decking, etc. Did you consider or it must have been considered how the rain gets off? Because you're loading large areas at the top of the building, flat surfaces. Usually we have one flat roof, we can get rid of it and drop it down. But with this design, you've got multiple flat roofs all over the building. The rain, how did you consider that in your initial design, or was it an engineering solution afterwards?
Well, of course, drainage of any horizontal surface is a must, and it is correct that we have increased horizontal surfaces in this building. But of course, we haven't done this in the first place to have more water to drain, but to create additional value of living space that I think completely augments the tower. So how to deal with the water is then a technical challenge that simply has to be resolved, but is resolved the same way how you would drain any other horizontal roof in the tower. It just kind of follows the entire length downwards. At the height of a skyscraper, the moment that you would introduce even balconies of certain scales, you would also have to probably drain them because you would not want the water to gush from any of such surfaces either. And in a way, we're here almost easier because we can do that internalized and bring the water back to the structural grids and take it down together with the structure.
Ollie, I assume that on the floors without pixels, there are apartments without balconies, is that correct? Yeah. Do they have opening windows?
Yes. So essentially, when you design, of course, in each case, you have to design very specific to a context. Designing in Singapore, for example, is something totally different to designing in Bangkok. And of course, designing commercial properties means you have to understand how efficiencies work, how gross floor area is counted, and how you can, in a way, maximize the systems in those ways. There are jurisdictions, such as Singapore, that allow you to build a certain amount of balcony area beyond the allowable internal GFA. In Bangkok, this is different. Every horizontal surface you build basically counts into the full GFA count. That means it becomes a great challenge to do small apartments with balconies when you have very little floor area actually available to accommodate. So in a way, the building was partly born out of a kind of strategic approach to that issue, to say smaller apartments that cannot afford outdoor terrace area are accommodated in the flat vertical parts, and the larger apartments in a way engage the outdoor space that becomes available. Then in return for the smaller apartments, we had developed a concept for how to fold open the vertical curtain wall and in a way still allow them to participate in the outdoors through those mechanisms. And that was indeed an idea initially generated to offset this disadvantage.
So if I may, when the building's occupied, there'll be a fair bit more movement in the, let's say, the flat parts of the facade. Yeah. And may I ask another question, if I can? At high levels in tall buildings, there's rarely a calm day. Could you talk a little bit about how the wind conditions are for the balcony spaces in the top of the building?
Well, again, provision of outdoor space. The ones of you that know Bangkok know that it can rain heavily, it can also be windy, but a lot of times it's actually very wind still. There are a number of examples in the city of sky decks and outdoor terraces that are actually usable at a surprisingly large number of days throughout the year. So of course this knowledge was the basis for creating this outdoor space that we believe is really going to be fully functional and usable for the vast majority of times. Also the observation deck at the very top, which will really, I think, be quite an extraordinary experience when you stand literally on the top of a building with absolutely nothing around you. I think very few buildings have actually achieved that. Typically you have to walk around the core and you're sort of squeezed between a facade and a little bit, but that doesn't give you the true sense of floating above a city. And I think that was an ambition we had here that we're able to realize, which is quite exciting, but yet of course also relies on the correct environmental conditions.
Actually, that reminds me of the walk they have on the what's that Grand Canyon, and the first time that you go there, and then the glass in the rear, and although it's designed to be very, very safe, but it still is a challenge to walk on it, and so I think that it's going to be a very interesting feature of this building, and we can't wait to go and stand there. So, are there any more comments? Yes, please.
Hi, Oli. I'm Lee. I'm an architect. I'm very familiar with the project They Interlace in Singapore because I worked there for 8 years, and then now I'm living in Taipei. And I'm also very familiar with the project of Duo, which is in Singapore, the mixed development. I sense that you are working on a lot of reinventing public spaces or community spaces in urban habitat, which is the tall building skyscraper. My curiosity is that, do you think high urban living environment will reach a point of saturation? And if not, what is the vision of urban habitat tall building in 10 years or 20 years to come?
Well, one thing we know about the future is that it's impossible to predict it, and that architects are notoriously bad at predicting the future. So I'll refrain from the guess of 10 or 20 years from now. But of course, I think we live in a world in which we're very aware of the fact that more and more people move to cities, that since a number of years now, over 50% of the world's population lives in cities, and that cities ultimately become denser and denser wherever we are. So to deal with the issue of density, I think is a very pertinent question for us as architects, and to investigate approaches for how we can kind of carve out new qualities in that vertical life is indeed, in this case, very literally, in many cases, more abstractly, I think the question. And I'm very interested in sort of challenging a kind of status quo that emerges typically out of systems that are kind of perfect and hermetic seals between planning regulations and commercial efficiencies that produce standard answers that we're all extremely familiar with. The one image I showed of Singapore, for example, or that we could show of many, many other places and cities in the world, are exactly that. They're not simply, I think, the unimaginative doom of architects that can't think of anything better, but they're actually kind of very hermetic and tough systems of realities to design in. And I think in that sense, when we talk about architecture today, we have a very different discussion than probably our fathers or grandfathers had during their times. 50 years ago, these systems did not exist in the same way. They did not kind of create these incredibly concealed spaces of maneuvering. And I think ultimately we have to understand the rules of the game that govern architecture in order to find mechanisms and ways to unlock these rules. Because of course all the buildings we're designing, they ultimately have to function also in this commercial world. Some of them of course push forward towards the limits, but the interlace, for example, as a building type, is able to accomplish the exact same efficiencies as the vertical high-rise versions, except they give much more space. A little piece of maths that we did at the time was just to say, if we take the site area, we subtract the footprint of the buildings, but we add back all the green gardens and terraces we create on these large roofscapes, we have 112% green space. So much more gardens than not having built a building on the site. I think similarly here with MahaNakhon, if we look at the amount of outdoor terraces we're creating and the interactivity that space allows between your indoor domain and outdoor domain, we're really maximizing the space of life for people. And I think we have to recognize both the social and also the commercial values that lie in these things, and they help to, I think, push things a step forward.
All right. Yes, please. Any questions? If not about the presentation, maybe if we could have a couple of remarks from our speakers and also maybe from the audience regarding the theme of this session, which is about future of tall. And of course, we just heard that we do not want to predict the future, but still this room is dedicated to the future of tall. So if I may have some ideas about what you think the major, I mean, this has been said a lot, but if from this sort of session also we could come up with some kind of idea of what the challenges would be, or what are the things that you think not too far in the near future, we are looking at maybe from architectural point of view, and if there are some engineers here from the engineering point of view. So may I first invite the two speakers to say something about that? About what do you think the main challenges in the future would be, from your point of view for the tall buildings?
Well, I think the key challenge is really the question how we can re-establish social and communal qualities in our environment. I think for a long time now already we have a debate on sustainability, and typically sustainability is framed as an environmental thing based on the question of energy. And of course this is a highly important question, and one that we have to deal with, employ all possible means of not only technology, I think also simply intelligence of design in order to deal with those. But ultimately, for me, the question of social sustainability stands still at the forefront of everything we do, and ultimately the question of quality. Is a building a great building? Do people want to be in a building? Because if you design a building that consumes 30% less energy, except nobody wants to be in it, then it doesn't help very much. So, and for me, the discussion is very often driven too much by technological might and means, and not enough by the question of how do we actually want to live and what is a great place to live. And only if we manage to generate that, then we can employ all the technology and all the possibilities we have to improve on the other aspects of that.
That well said, yes. Would you like to add something to that for the interior?
I believe for the architects, it's equally important to consider the space between the buildings. Either if it's in an urban environment or in the nature, there's a life and quality that is needed to be considered and given on the spaces in between. So either the building will go vertical or the higher. Always there's an engagement to the ground surfaces and what happens in between the life that is contained inside the building and what happens to the space and activities that happens in between these internalized spaces. So we believe that, I believe that to further consider the growth of the urban environments, the space as such, the in-between spaces are to be looked into and to be considered among all the architects or the planners, especially to question the quality of living.
Thank you. Anybody from the audience would like to join? We have time for 2 comments, and then we will close after that. Anybody would like to venture on what they think the challenges for the future of tall buildings would be or should be?
I mean, what does it mean, life quality? How do we define the life quality the space is generating? Because we can say, yeah, we want to live in a space that is comfortable. What is the set? How do we set for your building?
Well, yeah, very good question, and of course a very big question. I think in a way it starts already with the terminology of things. When you look at how things are being talked about, there are words, typically the word is not quality of life, but it's lifestyle. The way that things are communicated, often in a commercialized way, in which the focus, I think, is shifted away from what possibly a true quality is, and rather what aspirations supposedly have to be part of something that you actually don't know if you really want it, need it, or want to live with it. And for me, that's where part of the discussion has to start, are really what are the things we talk about, and what are the things that have meaning to how we exist. And in all of that, we propagate the achievement of the individual higher and higher. Of course, the possession of individual space and privatized space, sort of what seems to rule over everything. But indeed, I agree with the question, and that question again is very explicit, like, it is not only about what you own or inhabit inside a building, but it is also that what surrounds the building or that of the building that engage its surroundings. And it's the spaces and the qualities we can create in terms of how we coexist with others and not only by ourselves. I think for me this is a very central question to ask the responsibility of architecture as a player in a public domain ultimately, in the way in which a building defines and mediates between the individual and the group of human beings as a larger whole and the environment as a larger whole.